Today is the 10th of April, and I've been asked to comment on the current situation in Ukraine. I've been following, of course, the various news agencies and their reports from Ukraine and doing as much reading as possible to keep up with events which are moving very rapidly. As you know, as of today's date, there are still two cities in which pro-Russian forces have occupied administrative buildings, in Luhansk and in Donetsk. And it seems that that the situation in eastern Ukraine is still not very stable. As you know, the Crimea annexation took place in the month of March, and formally Crimea was annexed by Russia on the 18th of March, I believe it is, or 19th of March. With the downfall of Yanukovych and the coming to power of the pro-European forces in Ukraine, the people who support integration with the European Union, Ukraine has been faced with multiple crises that have been triggered by the change of government and obviously the more aggressive stance and behavior of Russia towards Ukraine, having lost its proxy president, that is Yanukovych, and having a government in power in Ukraine now which is looking to establish closer ties with the European Union. Russia has decided to use whatever means it has at its disposal to try to coerce, to try to force, or to try to even to the point of carving off territory and annexing that territory to Russia, as we've seen with Crimea. So in eastern Ukraine, we are seeing an attempt by Russia to, I think, achieve one of two goals. One goal would be to certainly have these territories become quasi-independent and under Russian protection. So Russia's trying to use pro-Russian elements in these areas to achieve those goals. At the same time, to keep pressure on the Ukrainian government, Russia has massed troops along Ukraine's borders, threatening to intervene if Ukrainian authorities crack down on these pro-Russian groups in eastern Ukraine that have seized these government buildings. So Ukraine is still in quite a weak position. The new government in eastern Ukraine is not trusted, I think, enough by the great majority of the population to be able to move more firmly against these pro-Russian groups. That's one thing. The other thing is it prefers not to use force, I think, against these groups, because if it does use force, this would give a pretext for Russian troops to intervene militarily, and it could destabilize the situation further. So Ukraine finds itself, or the Ukrainian authorities find themselves in a bit of a weak position. In addition to these factors, the local authorities, the local troops in the Ministry of Internal Affairs have also shown they're not very reliable. So in eastern Ukraine, the situation is still quite unclear as to which direction they will go in. What is clear is that Russia is using whatever it means it has, short of I think, full-scale military intervention at this time to try to destabilize the situation in eastern Ukraine even further, and using that destabilized condition to then further weaken Kyiv's authority in this region, with the goal of either having these regions become, like Crimea, quasi-independent, or to force the Ukrainian government to agree to a so-called solution of federalization, which would in effect make the eastern regions quasi-independent within Ukraine, but able to secede or able to veto any sort of decisions that the central government in Kyiv would want to make. So the central government in Kyiv finds itself in a very difficult situation because of the pressure that Russia is exerting, and in addition, as we know, the economic situation is very bleak. Russia is using not only military security levers against Ukraine, but is also using economic factors and its economic leverage to make the economic situation in Ukraine worse. That would further destabilize the situation. So Ukraine has to find a number of solutions to very critical problems quickly, and be able to do so without inflaming a situation, especially in eastern Ukraine, where the likelihood of bloodshed and further destabilization is certainly present. Hopefully, the Ukrainian authorities will be able to bring the situation in Luhansk and Donetsk under control by through negotiations with the pro-Russian forces, or through some sort of an agreement whereby these forces would agree to leave these buildings and then to take over these buildings and establish full control over Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. So we have a situation where Ukraine is facing military security crisis, a economic crisis, and a political crisis. All of these, I think, all these factors are there. And Russia, of course, is playing a very nasty game, a very vicious, aggressive game, hoping to come away with as much direct control over Ukrainian territory as possible, or indirect control. And the goal, of course, I think, for Russia is to either prevent the Ukrainian government from consolidating its rule over the country and from stabilizing the situation, and to go as far as to overthrow the Kyiv government and establish a government that would be willing to follow Moscow's lead, that is essentially to become a satellite or a subservient government. And it's unclear where things will lead at this point. One finds it difficult to make any kind of predictions.